In spite of my supreme athletic appearance, my supreme hand-eye coordination, what are you laughing at, Grant? I've never much been into tennis as a sport. I know the haters are going to hate, but I've never much been into tennis in spite of my parents' best efforts. They did enrol me in tennis coaching at my primary school at Rangeville State High in Toowoomba, and I'm pretty sure the tennis coach gave up on me before I gave up on tennis, and I did last about 3 weeks. So tennis has never been really my thing, but it's been a little bit hard to avoid here in Australia over the last month or so, or around about a month ago. We had the wonderful Australian Open happening, and there was a significant amount of media and press around the Australian Open. And I just want to, I'm probably not going to go where you think I'm going to go on that, but I just want to say it's kind of hard to go past these two legends. Louise is excited. But Ash Barty and Dylan Alcott were both significant stars of the Australian Open this year. And what I love about these two guys is the demeanour of themselves. I don't know if you heard or read some of Ash Barty's speech after she won the Australian Open Women's Championship. But she just has this, every time she's in an event and before the media, she brags about her opponent and how great they are. She talks about how significant and wonderful they've made the event. In her acceptance speech for the Australian Open, she talked about everyone from her family to her coach, to the crowd, to the ball boys, to the event organisers. She recognised and encouraged all the people around her whilst accepting the accolades and awards to which she was most deserving. Dylan Alcott played his semi-final, and hours after playing a semi-final, I mean, I can't imagine playing a semi-final in tennis, let alone doing so in a wheelchair. Hours after playing his semi-final, he's at the awards night for Australian of the Year. And he's awarded Australian of the Year. Now, I don't know if you've heard or read Dylan Alcott's speech for Australian of the Year. If you haven't, do yourself a favour. Incredibly moving speech. And here's this man who takes these enormous accolades given to him. He starts his speech by talking about the pandemic that we've just been through and talking about the heroism of the doctors and the nurses and the pathologists and the people supporting our medical community. And he says, and here I am getting this award as a bloke that plays tennis and likes to talk a lot. And so he acknowledges and receives the accolades and yet shares it with the community around him. He talks about his advocacy for disability and his desire to see people with disability contributing to their best contribution throughout the world. In part of his speech, and you probably need to read it in the context, but he says, people often ask me what my advice would be to young people with disabilities. And he says, my advice is, you don't need my advice. And he goes on to explain why he makes that statement. But what I love about both Ash Barty and Dylan Alcott is the way they display greater humility. That they just display that there's no pretense or arrogance about them. They just accept the accolades, stand in the spotlight, and bring it for others. And it's incredible and it's beautiful. And so this morning we're talking about greater humility. And a little bit, probably quite a bit of what I'm sharing this morning has been inspired by a book by an Aussie historian by the name of John Dixon. His book is called Humilitas. And in the beginning of the book, he makes this very prudent statement. He says, there is an obvious conundrum facing the writer of a book on humility. Does the author think he has already attained this difficult virtue? If so, he almost certainly hasn't. If not, why is he writing a book on the subject? It's an irony, and I share that irony with John Dixon today, and certainly stand before you not claiming that I have attained this virtue of humility, only that I'm on the journey and sharing some thoughts from that journey with you this morning. So you may have heard of a very famous C.S. Lewis quote about humility, which says humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Fantastic definition. Sounds like something C.S. Lewis would say, a great scholar and a great man of great wisdom. Only one problem with that statement: was never made by C.S. Lewis. It was actually a requote made by Rick Warren in his book, The Purpose-Driven Life. And I share that with you simply because I think the C.S. Lewis quote has so much greater depth and so much greater meaning than just this one sentence. And so C.S. Lewis actually says, do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmsy person who is always telling you that, of course, he is a nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will probably be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. What I love about that quote, well, there's much that I love about that quote, but this idea, he will not be a sort of greasy, smarmsy person who's always telling you, of course, that he is a nobody. You see, I think we have this perception of humility that it's about downplaying ourselves. It's about taking our strengths and pretending as if they're weaknesses. That it's about trying to be less than. And what I want to suggest to you today is that that is anything but the case. John Dickson, in his book, it's entitled Humilitas, which is based on a Latin word. And this Latin word had similar translations in Hebrew and Greek that both had similar meanings, and they had a positive and a negative meaning. The negative meaning was to be put low, to be humiliated. The more positive meaning was to lower yourself, to be humble. And interestingly, between the 2nd and 5th century in Rome, this idea of humilitas took on not only a new sense of meaning, but a new sense of respect. And it took on this meaning along the lines of redirecting your power in service of others, or holding your power in service of others, to forego status, to deploy your resources, to use your influence to the good of others before self. Can you get a picture of why I'm using the pictures of Ash Barty and Dylan Alcott here? It's interesting to note the time period from the 2nd to 5th century AD in the area of Rome. This idea of humility, see, prior to this, the idea of humility was something that was not a virtue that was held up to be valued. In fact, it was a sign of weakness. It was looked down upon. Society as a whole did not accept or endorse this idea of humility. It was to be avoided at all costs. But all of a sudden, during the 2nd to the 5th century in ancient Rome, this virtue became lauded, became looked up to, as in the shadow of the story that we've just had read to us, the followers of Jesus took seriously his words and began to act in ways of humility that started a revolution across the then known world, to completely transfer this idea of humility from being something that was looked down upon and considered low to be a virtue to be attained and aimed for. Interesting. So just to, I guess, dive a little bit deeper into this idea, I want to read to you a story from John's book, just a short story that goes like this. 3 young men hopped on a bus in Detroit in the 1930s and tried to pick a fight with a lone man sitting at the back of the vehicle. They insulted him. He didn't respond. They turned up the heat of the insults. He said nothing. Eventually, the stranger stood up. He was bigger than they had estimated from his seated position, much bigger. He reached into his pocket, handed them a business card, and walked off the bus and on his way. As the bus drove on, the young men gathered around the card to read the words, Joe Louis, boxer. They had just tried to pick a fight with the man who would be the heavyweight boxing champion of the world from 1937 to 1949. Heavyweight boxing champion of the world for 12 years. The number one boxer of all time, according to the International Boxing Research Organisation. These young men tried to pick a fight with a man who certainly could have sorted them out in probably 2 or 3 very swift blows. And this man chose to sit and be and withhold his power in the best interests of these young men. But what I love about this, see, if he was powerless in that situation, if he was probably anyone other than Joe Louis, what was happening in that moment is he was being humiliated. But because of the power that he held, he was able to adopt confidently a position of humility and to use that power in those young men's best interests. You see, he didn't just get up and leave, but he got up and gave them his business card as this very subtle little nod, as if to say, guys, just be careful. You never know who you might be picking on, and it might not end well. Like, he never said those words, but tell me that wasn't the message that those young men received on that day. And so he held his power not just for his own interests or the interests even of the rest of the people on the bus, but for those very young men themselves. I forgot my prop. These are unautographed Joe Louis original boxing gloves. All right, so we've talked about Ash and Dylan, we've talked about Joe Louis. So let's have a look at this reading from earlier, where Jesus begins to unpack this quite significant picture of humility. Given that we're in a church that celebrates the life and journey of Jesus, seems appropriate to do so. And so I'm not going to read through the verses. We've read through those that done so wonderfully for us. But I do just want to highlight a couple of key things from these verses. So let's just have a look here. And it took me a little while. I must have heard these words and read these verses many, many times before this stood out to me. But the very story that we hear starts with a little bit of a prelude and a little bit of introduction. It then starts with, Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything and that he had come from God and would return to God. So, the highlighting didn't go there by accident. Jesus knew this. He knew he had the full power of God in some way in human form, and because of that, so he grabbed a towel and went round and washed their feet. It was having a sense of the very essence of who he was that enabled him and empowered him to act in a way that we look at now as being an act of humility. You call me teacher, he says later on in the story. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right because that is what I am. Again, he reinforces this idea that yes, in the way we relate to one another, I have, there's an authority, there's a sense about me, there's a respect for me that motivates and sits behind this act. You see, without some sense of, I don't like the word power, I've really struggled to come up with a better one, but without a sense of power, of authority, of dignity in self, an act of humility is meaningless. In fact, without that sense, without that assurance of who I am in this space and what I have to bring, I would suggest that an act of humility is perhaps an act of self-humiliation. And this idea seemed to follow through. Later on in Philippians chapter 2, one of Jesus' later followers, Paul, was writing to a bunch of followers of Jesus, a bunch of believers, and he said, you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took on the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. Magnificent piece of writing, and it goes on to explain more of the Jesus picture and Jesus story. Though he was God, we need to start from that place. that this was a person of great significance, of worth, of value, of dignity. That's where it starts. As I said earlier, I think often we seem to think that humility is to see ourselves as powerless. This seems to suggest, this idea we're building up seems to suggest that actually without power, for want of a better word, without a sense of self, integrity in ourselves, we can't truly be humble. There's another quote that I love, and I'm going to remember my prop this time. Many, if not all of you, will be aware that I'm a bass player. No, not a guitar player, a bass player. There's a difference. And there's a couple of bass players that I look up to. One I've only really come across in recent years. A fellow by the name of Victor Wooten. Victor Wooten is the most incredible bass player. Anyway, I won't get sidetracked fangirling over Victor Wooten. He has this magnificent TED talk called Music as Language. Again, well worth a look. But he says, there's this quote that he says in there that I just want to draw out today. And he says to this, "If I use my greatness in the right way, it can help others rise up quickly. If someone puts you on a pedestal, don't climb down pretending to be humble. You stay up there, because if they put you up there, they're showing you how high they can see. Stay there and then pull them up. And they'll grow faster than if you come down. Stay there and pull them up, and then they'll grow faster than if you come down." So we're going to help these people, he says, because we're great. And in music, I'm not usually great until you say I am anyway. This idea of using what we have, holding power in service of others as John Dixon presents it. I've laboured the point a little bit on these verses. So let's move on. So in the story, what happens next? He got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water in the basin, began to wash his disciples' feet. Action, 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 action. This is an act of the will. It's choice upon choice upon choice upon choice. And so an act of humility is something that we get to choose to do. An act of humility imposed on us, I would propose, probably becomes an act of humiliation. And so, for us to experience greater humility, there will be choice. Possibly choice upon choice upon choice upon choice. We then move on a little bit further into the story. And Jesus makes this simple statement: I have given you an example to follow. I've given you an example. You've seen something. I have put something here for you. This was not some behind-the-scenes hidden thing. This was a very public act. And so humility is a social thing. It's a public thing. See, I think that sometimes we think humility is about brandishing proud thoughts. I can't think that about myself, or refusing to talk about our achievements, about, within ourselves seeking to just keep ourselves minimised and under control. Now, that might be modesty. However, I would propose it's not humility. Certainly not by this definition that we're looking at about withholding power for the good of others. It's a public act. So greater humility recognises the capacity, the dignity, the worth, the power and confidence, first of all, of myself, and second of all, of those with whom I might be in relationship. Greater humility is an act of the will. Greater humility is a public, shared, corporate experience. So that's a little bit of the what of greater humility. And we could probably spend quite some time unpacking that a bit more, which we're not going to do. So let's move on to the why. Why might we want to practice greater humility? Why might this be a good idea? Well, John Dixon proposes that the most influential and inspiring people are often marked with humility. That when we look around our world, the Ash Barty, the Dylan Alcotts, the Joe Lewises, the Victor Wootons, we could name people. If I could ask you to call out names of people who you look up to and aspire to and who demonstrate humility, and we would find many people demonstrate acts of humility. More than that, people with greater humility seem to have a capacity to inspire and encourage others to achieve more. A guy by the name of Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great. He engaged in a 5-year study of businesses that grew from being a good business to a great business. Some really high-achieving, significant businesses that he studied in his study, and wrote this book called Good to Great. And in his book, he says this: level 5 leaders, so these are the leaders that have the capacity to do something that other leaders haven't been able to do, that they can help this business move from good to great. Level 5 leaders display a powerful mixture of personal humility and indomitable will. Let's stick with greater humility, I can say that. And so this idea that actually people who inspire and motivate others to achieve beyond the bounds of what we think is possible have in common, interestingly, out of this study that Jim Collins did, a sense of greater humility. And ultimately, as we've kind of looked at already, humility is attractive and desirable in our world. Thankfully, thanks to that shift in culture in 2nd to 5th century Rome, it's something aspirational for us. It's something that we aspire to and look up to in our world. It's accepted as a virtue. And then, for those of us who claim to follow Jesus, for those of us who claim to be seeking after God's best for us and for our world, Jesus says in his actions and as he unpacks that with his followers, you ought to wash each other's feet. Do as I have done for you. Jesus invites, and perhaps even a little bit more strongly commands, that humility is to be a marker of Jesus' followers. And the even better thing is he says God will bless you for doing them. It's our invitation, it's our calling, and it's a blessing that Jesus gives to us. Why greater humility? Ultimately, I believe greater humility can genuinely change our world. Genuinely. It can change our world. What? Washing people's feet changes the world? Well, maybe not. Maybe cleaning your neighbour's toilet or vacuuming their floor might change their world. And I think it goes so much bigger and deeper than that as well. I need to throw back to John Dixon here. If humility is to hold your power for the good of others before yourself, it means treating those who hold contrary beliefs with respect and friendship. He goes on to talk about a marker of humility being the ability to strongly disagree with someone and to honour them at the same time, to give dignity, value, and significance to the other. Just imagine with me, if you would, the meetings of world leaders around the world. Go back in history to the many, sadly, battles, fights, wars that have broken out, sometimes even around religion. Just imagine with me, if you would, these people who hold strong and solid convictions, who hold a sense of power, sitting with those with whom they strongly disagree, and holding their sense of self, and withholding their power for the sake of others, engaging with dialogue, bringing honour and dignity and significance to those with whom they strongly disagree. Perhaps thinking it on a global, worldwide level is a little bit more difficult, but let's think about it in our own relationships. Those with whom we struggle. Or perhaps, as Craig and Donna have reminded us, as a community of faith, a church, what does God want us as NBC to see or to do in greater humility? Or any expression of Christian faith, to sit with a strong sense of who I am, what I have, what I hold, what I believe, with those who strongly disagree with me. With those who have a lifestyle to which I completely disagree. With those who have beliefs and values and worship with which I completely disagree. To withhold my power, not to feel like I need to defend myself because I am confident and sure of who I am. Not because I need to prove anything, because I am strong in what I believe. Not because I have to defend anything, because I know who I am. And I want to give dignity and honour and respect to them. And so I'm going to sit, I'm going to listen, I'm going to engage in dialogue. And all of a sudden, who I am and what I have to offer becomes so much more attractive. All of a sudden, a church that people feel like is putting walls up and barriers to those who think from a different way or come from a different lifestyle. All of a sudden, those barriers are torn down and the doors are thrown open. And people who want to know what is so wonderful and great about this person who just sat with me, and in C.S. Lewis's word, didn't seem like, they just seemed like they were interested in me. And all of a sudden the barriers are removed and relationship can be restored and explored together. As I hold my beliefs, as I hold not to say that I'm not compromising my beliefs. And I'm not sitting there in that moment even agreeing with their beliefs. I'm engaging in relationship and allowing them to sit with their dignity and their sense of self as I sit with my dignity and my sense of self. I withhold what I have for the sake of others. I redirect my power in service of others. Ash Barty, Dylan Alcott, Rick Warren, C.S. Lewis, Victor Wooten, and most especially Jesus, give us this incredible picture of greater humility. And they give us, perhaps, this message. Be so sure, be so strong, be so secure in who you are, that who you are doesn't even matter. And for those of us who take the life and the teaching and the power of Jesus as our example, who seek after God's best for us, we have an unfair advantage in this. Because the most secure place for us to start is to simply ask the question, who does God say I am? Am I secure in who God has made me to be and who God says I am? Am I secure in my identity in Christ? And if I am, I can hold that power. You see, I think the greatest underminer of humility is insecurity. Because there's everything to prove, everything to justify. And when we don't have that, we ask, who does God say I am? And we find ourselves digging deeper and deeper into that. And we find truths that we can stand rock solid on, which empower and enable us to act with humility, to withhold our power in the interests of others. Louise is just going to come up, and this idea of who does God say I am is possibly a lifelong journey, possibly the most important one that as followers of Jesus we could take. Let me give you a bit of a snapshot, just some of the things that God says we are. He says we're loved. He says we're accepted, forgiven, adopted by the Creator of the universe, sons and daughters, children of God Himself, saints. The list goes on and on and on. And the more secure we are in who God says we are, the more capacity and ability we have to withhold our power in the best interests of others. As we truly embrace and accept God's truth, we can literally do the most menial task like washing feet. I didn't unpack how significantly menial that task was in the time of Jesus, but it was significant. And as we accept and embrace God's truth, we can literally do the most menial task like washing feet. Or we can do the most important task, and we can give dignity value and respect to those around us. We can spur others on to greatness. We can honour others wherever they are, whoever they are, whatever they believe and whatever they say. And as followers of Jesus, people will be drawn to us, not pushed away. They'll be drawn to our Jesus, the one who demonstrated the greatest humility that the world has ever seen. Greater humility. Who does God say I am? How do I embed myself more securely in that so that I can follow the example of Jesus? What is the greater humility that God wants me to see today? What is the greater humility that God wants us as a faith community here at NBC to see today? What is the greater humility that God wants me to do? What does that look like in my world? What is the greater humility that God might invite NBC, our faith community, into as we hold our power in the best interest for others? We do it time and time again. We hear so many beautiful stories about our faith community doing this. Who does God say I am? So we're going to take some moments. Arabella's going to sing one of my personal all-time favourite songs that just simply reflects on who does God say I am. And as she does so, perhaps you just want to take some moments just to ask God that same question. Who do you say I am? Maybe you want to ask someone to pray with you over that. Maybe you want to like someone to speak those words of truth over you. You are loved. You are forgiven. You are a child of God. We'd love to have some prayer team available to do that for you today. If you're online, the number will just appear on the bottom of the screen there. We would love for you to text through to that number, and we would love for someone just to call you back to pray with you, inviting you into a new truth about who God says you are, to speak God's words over you, to give you a strength of dignity and assurance and power that enables you and helps you to grow in greater humility. And so during this time, the opportunity is yours just to respond as you need, just to receive prayer, to pray, just to ask God to reveal to you who he says you are, to empower and enable you to step into greater humility today and tomorrow.